They started arriving at 7 in the morning. 50 charter buses rolling down a private gravel road that belonged to me and nobody else, and by 7:40 the lead bus was sitting 6 inches from a locked steel gate with 49 more lined up behind it, stretching all the way back to the county highway, and the HOA president was standing at my fence line with his phone pressed to his ear, looking like a man who had just understood that his entire plan had a fatal flaw he had not bothered to check for. The flaw was my gate, and my gate was locked. And I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee watching every bit of it unfold. My name is Edward Call, and I am 51 years old, and I spent 23 years working in event logistics and large-scale venue operations before I bought land and got out of that world entirely because I had seen enough poorly planned large gatherings to last several lifetimes. I own 114 acres in Bozeman, Montana in Gallatin County, and it is the kind of land that makes people who visit it understand immediately why someone would pay whatever it costs to own it. Rolling grassland with a creek running through the lower section and a tree lane of lodgepole pine along the northern boundary, and a view of the Bridger Range from my back porch that I have never once taken for granted in the 6 years I have lived here. I run a small cattle operation, and I lease the hay fields to a neighboring farmer, and I live quietly, and I like it that way. What I did not like was the Ridgemont Valley Community Association deciding that my land was the solution to a problem they had created entirely by themselves. The Ridgemont Valley development sat on 340 acres east of my property, and it had been built in phases between 2015 and 2020, resulting in a community of 312 homes organized around a central clubhouse and a network of maintained common areas that the HOA managed with what I will acknowledge was genuine professionalism for the first 4 years of the community's existence. The board that ran it during those early years was composed of people who understood the difference between managing a residential community and running a personal fiefdom, and during that period I had exactly 0 interactions with the association because there was nothing to interact about. Then that board cycled out and a man named Stuart Briggs ran for president and won. Stuart was 48 years old and had made a significant amount of money in commercial real estate development in Denver before relocating to Montana with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has decided they are going to bring their metropolitan energy to a place that neither requested nor required it. He was compact and fast-moving and had the quality of a man for whom every situation is primarily an opportunity to demonstrate his own capabilities, and he had looked at the Ridgemont Valley HOA and seen not a community governance responsibility but a platform. Within his first year as president, he had expanded the annual community events budget by 300%, organized a summer festival that had received regional press coverage, and begun planning what he described at a board meeting that a resident later told me about as the signature event that would put Ridgemont Valley on the map as a destination community. The signature event was an autumn heritage tour. The concept, as Stewart had apparently pitched it to the board, was a coordinated bus tour of the historic agricultural landscapes surrounding the Ridgemont Valley development that would take residents and their guests through the Gallatin County countryside on a curated route showcasing working farms and ranch land and the natural beauty of the valley. He had engaged a tour operator out of Bozeman named Cascade Charter Services and contracted for 50 buses to accommodate what he projected would be approximately 2,500 participants drawn from residents, and an open community ticket sale he had promoted through local media and the Ridgemont Valley social media accounts. What Stewart had not done was contact any of the landowners whose property his curated route passed through or across, or in one case directly over, in the form of a road that ran through private land before connecting to a Forest Service access point he apparently intended to use as the tour's scenic highlight. That road was mine. 9/10 of a mile of gravel road crossing my southern pasture that I had built myself in 2019 to access the lower creek section of my property, and that connected at its far end to a Forest Service trailhead through a gate that was on my land and that I had built and maintained at my own expense. I found out about the tour 11 days before it was scheduled to happen, and I found out not because Stewart had contacted me, but because a woman named Patricia Hensley, who lived in Ridgemont Valley and who had purchased a ticket to the tour, called me to ask whether I was excited about having so many visitors come through my property, because she had read the tour description on the HOA's event page and it mentioned the scenic private ranch road crossing with a photograph that was clearly taken from my southern pasture looking toward the creek and the Bridger Range beyond it, and she thought it was wonderful that I had agreed to participate. I told Patricia I had not agreed to participate and I had not been contacted, and I asked her to send me the event page link, which she did within minutes, and I sat at my kitchen table and read the entire tour description twice and looked at the photograph of my land that Stuart had apparently taken from somewhere along my fence line and used in his promotional materials without asking me, and I felt the particular cold clarity that comes when you understand a situation completely and know exactly what you are going to do about it. I called an attorney named Renata Shaw, who practiced property and land use law in Bozeman and who I had worked with when I purchased the property. I described the situation and sent her the event page link, and she called me back within the hour. She told me the situation was straightforward and entirely in my favor because my road was private property and Stuart had no right of access to it, and the Forest Service gate at the end of my road was on my land and under my control, and that advertising a tour route across private property without the owner's consent was not only legally indefensible but potentially exposed the HOA to significant liability if anything went wrong during the event involving participants on my land. She asked me how I wanted to handle it, and I told her I had two approaches in mind and wanted her opinion on both of them. The first approach was to send a cease and desist immediately, demanding the tour route be changed and the promotional materials referencing my property be removed. The second approach was to say nothing and let the event proceed to the point where 50 buses arrived at my locked gate, and then deal with it from a position of complete documented clarity about what had happened and why. Renata was quiet for a moment, and then she said the first approach was cleaner from a pure legal standpoint because it gave Stuart the opportunity to correct the problem before it became a public spectacle. I told her I understood that, and I also told her that I had spent 11 days worth of thought in the past 90 seconds, and that the reason I was leaning toward the second approach was not petty satisfaction but something more specific, which was that a man who had taken a photograph of my land from my fence line without permission and used it in commercial promotional materials and routed 50 buses across my property without a single phone call was a man who needed to understand the consequences of that kind of assumption in a way that a cease and desist letter delivered 11 days before the event might not fully communicate. Renata said she understood my reasoning and that if I chose the second approach I needed to document everything from this moment forward and do nothing that could be construed as interference with the event beyond simply exercising my right to control access to my own property. I told her that was exactly what I intended to do, and she told me to call her the morning of the event. I spent the next 10 days preparing quietly and thoroughly. I had a locksmith install a new heavy-duty padlock on my southern pasture gate at the point where my gravel road began, and I documented the installation with photographs and kept the only 2 keys on my person at all times. I set up 2 trail cameras covering the gate from different angles so I would have continuous video documentation of everything that happened at that location on the day of the event. I pulled the tour's promotional materials from the HOA event page and saved screenshots of everything, including the photograph of my land and the tour description referencing the scenic private ranch road crossing and the ticket pricing and the projected attendance figures. I sent copies of all of it to Renata along with a written timeline of when I had learned about the event and through what means, and I asked her to prepare a formal demand package that could be filed immediately after the event concluded. The morning of the tour was a clear October Saturday with that particular Montana autumn light that makes the mountains look like they have been painted onto the sky, and I was on my porch with coffee at 6:30 when I heard the first bus on the county road. By 7 the lead bus had turned onto the approach to my southern pasture, and by 7:15 it was sitting at my locked gate, and by 7:40 all 50 buses were lined up behind it in a column that stretched the full length of my property boundary along the county road and continued around the corner for another quarter mile. I watched all of this from my porch without moving. Stuart arrived at my gate in a black SUV at 7:52, and I watched him get out and look at the lock and look at the gate and look at the column of buses behind him and then look toward my house where I was visible on the porch, and I watched him walk across to my fence line and call out to me. I set down my coffee and walked down to where he was standing on his side of the fence. He introduced himself as though we had not been neighbors for 6 years in the way that people introduce themselves when they are trying to establish authority in a situation where they feel it's slipping away from them, and he told me there seemed to be a misunderstanding about the gate and asked whether I had a key and could open it to allow the tour to proceed. I told him there was no misunderstanding about the gate and that it was locked because it was the gate on my private property, and I had locked it because 50 charter buses were about to attempt to drive across my land without my permission, and I had decided not to allow that. He told me the tour had been planned for months and that 2,000 people had purchased tickets and that the route had been publicized and that he was asking me as a neighbor to work with him on this. I told him I understood all of that, and I told him it was not my problem because he had planned the tour across my land without contacting me and had used a photograph of my land in his promotional materials without my consent and had contracted with a charter company to bring 50 buses across my property without asking me a single question about whether I was willing to allow any of it, and the answer, as he could see, was that I was not. His expression during that conversation went through several stages that I found professionally interesting to observe because I had spent 23 years in event logistics and I recognized each stage. First, there was the confident assumption that the obstacle was temporary and would yield to reasonable explanation. Then there was the recalculation when the obstacle did not yield. Then there was the shift to pressure when recalculation failed, which manifested as a series of statements about community relationships and goodwill and the disappointment of 2,000 ticket holders that were clearly intended to make me feel responsible for a situation I had not created. And then finally there was the particular stillness of a man who has run out of moves and is standing in front of a locked gate with 50 buses behind him and no plan for what happens next. I told him I was going to go back to my porch and finish my coffee and that if he wanted to have a conversation about the situation he should have his attorney call Renata Shaw, and I gave him her number and walked back up to my house. What happened over the next 4 hours on that county road I observed from my porch and from the trail camera footage I reviewed later, and it was a masterclass in the consequences of large-scale event planning, conducted without adequate due diligence. Cascade Charter Services had 50 buses sitting on a county road with engines running and drivers who were contracted for a specific route and timeline and no alternative plan because the charter contract had been written around the specific route Stewart had provided. The tour participants who had arrived in their own vehicles and were parked along the road and in a staging area Stewart had arranged at the development entrance were being told by HOA volunteers that there was a brief delay due to an access coordination issue, which was the language Stewart had apparently decided to use and which satisfied nobody for very long. Stewart spent the first hour on his phone, and I could see from my porch that he was making a large number of calls in rapid succession and that none of them appeared to be producing solutions. At 9:15, a Gallatin County Sheriff's deputy arrived, which Stewart had apparently called on the theory that law enforcement could compel me to open my gate, and the deputy walked to my fence line and I met him there and I showed him my deed on my phone and the gate installation photographs and explained the situation in about 4 minutes, and the deputy nodded and walked back to Stewart and they had a conversation that I could not hear, but that resulted in the deputy getting back in his vehicle and driving away without any action being taken against my gate or against me. At 10:30 Renata arrived because I had called her at 8 and she had decided to come in person, which I had not asked her to do but which I was grateful for because her presence made it clear to Stewart and to whoever he was consulting by phone that this situation had legal representation on my side that was present and prepared. She walked to the fence line and spoke with Stewart for about 12 minutes, and I stood nearby and listened, and what I observed was a man being told by an attorney who had prepared for this conversation in advance exactly what his exposure was and watching the color of that information register on his face in real time. Renata told him the HOA faced liability for trespass and unauthorized use of private property and unauthorized commercial use of photographic images of private land and potential claims from Cascade Charter Services for the failed route and from ticket holders for the disrupted event, and that the total exposure was significantly larger than whatever the event budget had been, and that the path to limiting that exposure began with acknowledging that the route should never have been planned across private property without owner consent, and ended with a formal resolution that addressed all of the resulting claims in a comprehensive and documented way. Stewart made one more attempt at that point, which was to offer me a participation fee on the spot if I would open the gate and allow the tour to proceed, and I told him through Renata that we were past the point where opening the gate was an option and that the conversation about resolution needed to happen through attorneys, and that today's event was not happening on my land under any circumstances. By noon, the buses had begun turning around, which on a county road with 50 charter buses requires a logistical effort that I will describe only as time-consuming and leave it there because the details of a 50-bus turnaround on a 2-lane Montana road speak for themselves. By 2 in the afternoon, the county road was clear and the tour participants had dispersed, and the Autumn Heritage Tour of Ridgemont Valley was over, having visited no heritage and no valley and having produced instead a County road traffic situation that the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office later described in a public statement as one of the more unusual Saturday mornings in recent departmental memory. The legal process that followed moved on the timeline that legal processes in Montana move on, which is deliberately and without rushing, and that was fine with me because every week that passed added documentation to a record that was already very solid. Renata filed the formal demand package the Monday after the event, covering unauthorized use of private property and unauthorized commercial use of photographic materials and economic damages, including the administrative costs I had incurred in preparing for and managing the event day. She also filed a complaint with the Montana Board of Realty about the HOA's management company, which had signed off on the event plan without apparently conducting any verification of the route's land use permissions, which is a professional standards failure of a fairly basic kind. Stewart's attorney responded 2 weeks later, and the negotiation that followed took 3 months but produced a settlement that I considered comprehensive and fair. The HOA paid my legal fees in full and paid a damages figure that covered the economic costs Renata had documented, and paid a separate amount for the unauthorized use of my land's photograph in commercial promotional materials, which the HOA's marketing director had apparently sourced from Stewart's personal phone without any rights clearance process whatsoever. The HOA also provided a written acknowledgement that my road and gate were private property and that no access right existed for any Ridgemont Valley resident or HOA-affiliated event, and that acknowledgement was recorded in Gallatin County as a supplemental instrument attached to the relevant parcel records. Cascade Charter Services filed their own claim against the HOA for the failed charter contract, and I understand that claims settled separately on terms I was not party to, but that the charter company's attorney described to Renata in passing as satisfactory, which I took to mean the HOA's event budget for the following year was going to look considerably different from the one Stewart had assembled. Stewart Briggs did not seek re-election to the board presidency when his term concluded 8 months after the event. I heard from Patricia Hensley, who still occasionally calls me with Ridgemont Valley news, that he had told people at the annual meeting that he was stepping back to focus on other priorities, which is the language people use when the other priorities include not being the person who organized the tour that ended with 50 buses stuck on a county road in front of a locked gate while 2,000 ticket holders asked for refunds. The new board president reached out to me through a letter 6 weeks after taking the position, and the letter was brief and professional and simply introduced herself and noted that the board understood the importance of respecting neighboring landowners' property rights and that she looked forward to a positive neighborly relationship going forward. I wrote back a short note saying I appreciated the letter and shared the same hope, and that concluded the only direct communication I have had with the Ridgemont Valley HOA since the settlement was signed. My gate is still there, and it still has a heavy-duty padlock on it, and I still have the only 2 keys, and every autumn when the light hits the Bridger Range in that particular way and the grassland turns the color it turns, I think about that Saturday morning and 50 buses on a county road and Stewart Briggs standing at my fence line asking me to open a gate he had never once thought to ask permission to use. I think about the coffee I finished on my porch while he was making his phone calls, and about Renata arriving in her car and the deputy driving away, and the long, slow process of 50 buses finding somewhere to turn around on a 2-lane Montana road. I do not think about it with anger anymore because the settlement resolved what needed resolving, and the recorded instrument in Gallatin County says what it needs to say, and the gate has not been tested since. I think about it the way you think about a situation that confirmed something you already believed, which is that the most powerful position in any dispute over private land is to simply know what you own and be willing to stand at the boundary of it while the other side figures out that they have no plan for what happens when you do. 2,000 people bought tickets to see my land that autumn. None of them saw it. But every one of them now knows it exists and knows exactly whose it is, and I think that is probably the most effective property rights education a working cattle rancher in Gallatin County has ever managed to deliver without saying a single public word. If someone has ever assumed access to something that belonged to you and found out the hard way that assumption is not the same thing as permission, I want to hear about it in the comments, because those stories matter, and the details of how people respond when a gate is locked that they expected to be open say everything about how prepared they were to be told no. Subscribe for more and share this with anyone who owns land and has ever wondered whether a good lock is worth the investment, because in my experience the answer is always yes.